Hey, hey, hey. Welcome, everybody, to the Talk of the Class podcast. I am Bryce Brown. I'm going to be your host and your guide on this education journey as we set out to try to answer some of the questions that we have in K 12 education about how to make things better. What are some of the obstacles that we're facing? What are some of the wonderful things that teachers are doing? And come up with some real solutions for some of those issues and challenges as we move forward throughout the life of the podcast, I guess you will. What I want to do as we move forward is bring on educators, allow them to share their stories, talk about the challenges that they're facing. There are some things that are kind of universal across the country in terms of the big key issues for educators, but there's also stuff that may affect somebody in some geographic region or in some certain demographic that isn't necessarily affecting anyone else, and you may not be familiar or aware that it's even happening. So my goal here is to kind of bring those voices together and hope that we can make something special as we move through this journey. So with this first episode, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about myself, where I come from, what my education journey has been, and hopefully be able to relate to some of you as you're listening. Or maybe you have a similar experience, or you know someone who's had similar experiences, and they might be able to get something out of this podcast. So, as I mentioned, my name is Bryce. I am a career educator. I really haven't done much of anything else outside of education. I don't come from an educated background per se. My mother has worked office jobs her entire life, payroll, accounts payable, things like that, executive assistants. My father is a working musician. He's a business owner now, but when I was growing up, he was a working musician. And my stepfather was a very blue collar, a transmission mechanic. And so I didn't come from people who had a lot of experience in education, a lot of knowledge about the inner workings of education, but I came from people who put a major value on education. It was kind of seen as our ticket out of the situation that we were in. So my parents were always really big on education being the vehicle that led us to bigger and better things in our lives. They didn't want us having to work some of the same jobs that they had worked or struggle in the way that they had struggled. So I knew from an early age that school was going to be a really important piece of my life. What I didn't know is how to turn that into something that would be meaningful to me, but I could also make a living doing. And when I was in the fourth grade, I got the opportunity to meet somebody who would have probably the greatest impact on me as an educator, and that was my fourth grade teacher. And I had always been a great student in terms of on paper. I did my work really well. I made good grades, but I was bored. I didn't really feel challenged. I didn't feel like the work was relevant per se. I didn't understand kind of what the long-term meaning was behind any of the stuff that we were doing. And so I would find myself getting in some trouble, not any kind of major trouble, but I would finish my work very quickly, and then I would start talking to my classmates, and I would, want to get up out of my seat, and I would want to do something to engage myself, to entertain myself. And what my fourth grade teacher did for me is that she saw kind of that fire, that burn for learning, and really took it upon herself to engage that and facilitate that. And she started to challenge me. She asked me questions that were hard to answer. She asked me questions that required me to seek out answers. She also welcomed questions. She didn't mind being challenged if it was in the name of learning. And what I got out of that year was that you could make that kind of impact on young people just by showing them how meaningful learning could be. And at 10 years old, I made the decision right then that this is what I was going to do with my life. I wanted to be Mrs. Barrier. So shout out, Mrs. Barrier, if you happen to come across this episode. Obviously, we've stayed in contact for over 25 years now. She's continued to be a huge support for me. She's always checked in on me and made sure that I was pushing myself to meet my potential. So I'm sure at some point she will listen to this because she supported me every step of the way. But it really changed my whole direction, because up until that point, I was learning because I was told that that's what I was supposed to do. And from that point on, I was learning because it motivated me. If I learned a little bit about a topic, I wanted to know more. And I kind of challenged myself to learn as many things about as many things as I possibly could. And that kind of became the foundation for a lifetime of never being satisfied with information. It's the reason that I have worked in education my entire adult life. It's the reason that I've pretty much been a career student as well. My wife will tell you I've gone to school enough. I don't need any more of it. But it's just always kind of been a means to an end to gain information. So I knew, like I said, from 10 years old, that this is what I wanted to do, but I didn't necessarily know how to get there. As I had mentioned earlier, I didn't really come from not only a background that had the information, but also the means to provide me with an education. I came from a very working class family, so money for college wasn't really on the table. So as much as it was expected that I would go on to the next level, how I was going to go about doing that was never really laid out for me. I remember having conversations with my stepfather where he would say, you know, you're going to school, you're going to get your degree. And I would say, great, how? And he would go, you're going to school, you're going to get your degree. So I started to really get concerned as I was headed through high school that my goal to become a teacher wasn't necessarily as realistic, because as we all know, you need a degree to do that. And to get a degree, you need money. And I didn't have any. To perhaps add an additional layer of challenge, when I was 17 years old, my oldest daughter was born. My wife and I have been together since the 8th grade, and we got a pretty early start. So both of us had kind of plans for what our life was going to look like. And, life kind of threw its plans back and said, well, minor adjustment, guys. So it kind of shifted my focus, not necessarily for what my long-term goal was going to be, but again, it just created another layer of how am I going to do it? I know what I want to do, but I have other responsibilities. I have other priorities. And if I already didn't have the money for school, I definitely don't have it now, you know. And so when I graduated high school, my wife and I got married very shortly after high school, and I went to work. Uh, she ended up going to nursing school, and we kind of made that decision together that if we could get her through a program where she could be kind of the primary support system for a period of time, then it would be my opportunity at that point to go and pursue my goal of becoming a teacher. So my path to get there was a little different, and it also meant that if I was going to teach, there wasn't really a situation where I was going to be able to take a huge amount of time away from work to do student teaching and, you know, any of your intern hours, things like that. So when I was 20, I was fortunate enough to land a teacher's aide position. We call them paraprofessionals, but I actually had someone tell me the other day that they use the term educational aides or educational assistants, and they don't use the term paraprofessionals. And I loved that because there was nothing para about what we were doing. I'll tell you this right now. If you are support staff, education aide, educational assistant, you're the lifeblood of a school district. Things do not operate without those people. And I know that firsthand because I had my hand in just about everything that was going on in that school. And so what that position allowed me to do was work in a school setting, make a little bit of money. Anyone who's worked in that type of position will tell you, if you think teacher salaries are laughable, those support staff salaries are ridiculous. But it gave me my first taste of what it was going to be like working in the school district, good and bad. I got an opportunity to work with kids, and it only solidified that passion for trying to bring some sort of value to learning for the kids, making them understand that information is everywhere, and the more of it that you have, the more marketable, the more skilled you're going to be. And so that part of that period of my life was incredibly important. What it also taught me was that you don't always get rewarded for the work that you're putting in. And that would also be pretty vital in my preparation for becoming a teacher, because we kind of grow up with this idea that teachers are, 8 to 4 employees. They get these long breaks at Christmas. They get 2 months off in the summertime. They're just hanging out with kids all day and, chit-chatting in the teacher's lounge, and everybody's having a good time. And you don't really realize the number of hours that are getting put in without any additional compensation. And being an aide really kind of opened my eyes to that, because there was a stipulation in the contract, and most of you will know what I'm talking about. It's referred to as the other duties as assigned piece of the contract. And it basically means that you work for the district, and whatever they need you to do, that's what you're going to do. And so during my 3 years working in that capacity, I taught non-core subject classes. When we, lost a teacher during the year, I provided one-on-one support. I was a PE coach. I was a discipline aide. I handled our in-school suspension classes. I pretty much did everything. And in a given week, I might do 3 different jobs, because you would show up in the morning and they would go, hey, this person's out today, or this teacher's going to be out for the next 6 weeks. This is what we need you to do. And that also meant everything that comes with that position. So if I was, teaching a class, I taught an elective class at one point. I was still writing the lesson plans for it, but I wasn't getting paid like a teacher. So I was doing the grading, I was doing the planning, but I wasn't getting the benefits of being a teacher. And so I do think that really prepared me for just kind of coming to that understanding that it's what's needed for the district. And if you can get on board with that, you can keep that passion. I really did enjoy the time that I spent in that position because I made wonderfully impactful relationships that, nearly 15 years down the road are still a huge part of my life. I worked with kids who are adults with their own kids now that I still see around town and have great conversations with. But it was difficult. It was a difficult job. And one of the things that I hope I can do with this podcast is shed light on the fact that it is not an easy job. But just because there are issues that we wish were resolved doesn't mean that the job's not worth doing. I will tell you right now, I've got an 18-year-old daughter who will be leaving next week for college, and she's going to study education. And if I didn't believe in my heart that it was a wonderful profession, I would never have allowed my daughter to go into it. So I genuinely feel like no matter what the issues are in this profession, it is an incredibly noble thing to do, and it's one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life. So at the end of those 3 years, I finished school, got my certification, and was able to land my first teaching job. And and there's probably some of you with a similar experience here too, but when you get used to making about $15,000 a year, you pretty much jump at the first opportunity to take a teaching job. So when I say I was not picky, I was not picky. I put in applications and I told my wife, the first school that offers me something, I'm taking it, because it's a guaranteed double, in some cases nearly triple my salary, to work the same hours I've been working and to do what I've always wanted to do. So I'm jumping on it. And fortunately for me, I didn't have to wait that long. I think I started applying, and by the next week, I had my first interview, and by the week after, I had my first teaching gig. So I was very fortunate there. If you are a new teacher coming in now, you are probably not blind to the fact that there is a massive teacher shortage across the country. So you may have a similar experience where, you can kind of go wherever you want to go and get it done in a very short period of time, because there's just not enough teachers. And so if you put in those applications and are willing to, go take a job that maybe isn't, the school that you counted on your whole life just to gain experience, you're going to land a job pretty quickly, I would have to imagine at this point. The downside was that that job was a fourth grade self-contained classroom. So not only had I never worked with elementary kids before, I had never been with the same group of kids all day. Um, Outside of my own children, I had never spent that much time with any one child. And so I was in for kind of an eye-opener. 10-year-olds are a different breed. It was funny and not lost on me that my first opportunity to teach was the same age group that I was whenever I made the decision to teach. So that part of it was kind of funny and kind of full circle for me. But I found very quickly that I was woefully unprepared, not just for fourth grade, but for teaching. I am a firm believer that there is only so much that you are going to get out of a pedagogy class or a education program. Hands-on experience is priceless when it comes to teaching because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know how you're going to respond to kids that try to press your buttons. You don't know how to manage your own classroom that you're not walking into with someone else's rules already in place. So, student teaching, it gives you experience in the classroom, but that's someone else's class. That's someone else's classroom management. That's someone else's rules, someone else's grading procedures. It doesn't necessarily show you what it's like to build your program within your own class, your culture in your classroom. And so I was knocked off my feet from the first week. I did not have great classroom management skills. I didn't feel like I related to the kids very well, despite the fact that I had come from, like I had mentioned earlier, pretty humble beginnings. I did grow up in a suburban school in a relatively small district. And I was now teaching in a huge Title I district. 90% of our kids were qualified as low socioeconomic status. About 20% of our students faced some degree of homelessness. And I was a 24-year-old white man teaching predominantly minority children. And so they didn't necessarily respond to me immediately because I was a stranger. I didn't, look like them. I didn't sound like them. I hadn't figured out how to connect yet. And that's on me because it's not a 10-year-old's job to figure out how to build a relationship. And so I would be lying if I didn't tell you that I thought I made a mistake. I found myself thinking the only thing I wanted to do since I was 10 years old was not what I thought it was going to be. I'm not cut out for this. And when we came home for Thanksgiving break, I told my wife I was going to quit. I was overwhelmed. I was not doing a good job in my eyes. I would find out later from my principal that I was doing fine. I was a first-year teacher, and I was doing exactly the way she expected me to do. But I didn't feel like I was making a difference for those kids. And luckily, my wife is far less impulsive than I am. And she, talked me into not only finishing out the semester, but not making a dumb decision that I wouldn't be able to go back on. I had put in so many years to this plan, it would be a disservice to myself and to the profession for me to give it 3 months and already decide that it wasn't what I was meant to do. And so taking that week off at Thanksgiving and really thinking about what I wanted out of not only the rest of that year, but out of my career. And I really started to hone in on what my purpose was as a teacher. And I remembered teachers that I had throughout school, through middle and high school and into college, who had taken the time to find common ground and let us know that we were people and we were important, and our opinions and our ideas and our feelings were valid. And so I went back and slowly started the process of finding what I had in common with each of those kids individually. Some were easy, some were not. And again, I take the blame on that because I had wasted so much time in the beginning trying to kind of build that barrier of teacher versus student, that I was having a really hard time letting them know that they could trust me. And so ultimately, as the year went on, I figured out how to manage my classroom. I figured out what I wanted those kids to think of me. I wasn't there to be their friend, but I also wasn't there to have a supervisor or any kind of punitive type relationship with them. Like, you're not in my class as punishment, so I shouldn't treat you like you're doing something wrong when you walk in, and so ultimately it came down to, when they look back at me, how do I want them to remember me as their teacher? Because as much as, I talked earlier about my fourth grade teacher changing my life, there are teachers that I've had over the years who have had an equal impact negatively. And I don't think I would have been able to live with the thought of being that teacher for somebody. And so by the end of the year, I had a really good relationship with, I would say, probably 95% of my students. There were a couple that just weren't going to like me. And, you're going to have that. I think to believe that you're going to win over 100% of any group is foolish, and it's unrealistic. But if you can make an impactful, lifelong, change or difference in a kid's life, one kid is worth whatever headache it did. So having 25 of them, if I impacted 15 to 20 of them positively, then I can go home at the end of the day and feel good about what I had done. But that being said, as much as it taught me how to be a teacher and how to build relationships, it also taught me I was not an elementary school teacher. So fourth grade, 1 year, done, not teaching fourth grade anymore. And I ended up putting in a transfer within our district. So I stayed with the same school district, and I moved to middle school, which was an age group that I had experience with as a teacher's aide. It's a group that I had always kind of felt were a little more relatable. They were old enough where you could kind of talk to them. You could have those like man-to-man type talks and those life lesson type talks. but also they were young enough where they didn't know it all already. Some of them thought they did, but I think if given enough time, most of them were pretty receptive to what you had to say. And what it also did was it gave me the opportunity to teach a subject area, focus on one subject area that I was incredibly passionate about. So I had studied history in college, and that was my concentration area. And I got the opportunity to teach history full time. And so I can't understate the importance of finding what it is that you're passionate about discussing, and then sharing that passion with the students that you're working with. My entire approach to teaching changed because I was excited to talk about my content every day. And that's not to say that I wasn't excited to talk to my kids when I taught fourth grade, but I was getting to spend my entire day talking about history and being passionate about my subject. And it goes a long way in overcoming those inevitable obstacles that you're going to face in your classroom on a day-to-day basis. What it also did, and early on I was not happy about it, it was another situation where, given my background as a teacher's aide, which anyone who's been a teacher's aide knows that a lot of times you end up working the special ed side of things because that's where we need our most support staff, right? You need as many people on deck in special ed as possible. They decided with the middle school students that I would actually have all coded students, which I was teaching my first year, 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. And so any student that fell under the umbrella of special ed or 504 in the 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade, I was their history teacher. And again, as a young teacher, I kind of took exception to it because it meant more work, more differentiation, more scaffolding, more paperwork. And I had less time to really focus on building the kind of lesson that I wanted to build, at least early on. The longer you do it, the more you start to realize that scaffolding and that differentiation, it's just good teaching practice. And so whether you're dealing with a large number of special education students or not, you should be differentiating your lessons. So it became just part of the process. But that year also helped me really hone in on that first year. That it really helped me hone in on my classroom management skills, because if you've been around 13 and 14-year-old kids, you know that it is impossible to keep them entertained or engaged for more than half a second. And you also know that they will challenge authority. And if they don't trust you and they don't like you, or they don't feel like what you're telling them is important, then they will act out. And history is one of those subjects where for some kids, it was invigorating. They loved it. They were enthralled by the lessons we were learning. But for other kids, it was, this already happened. Why do I need to learn this? This is stupid. And so it was a challenging job. It was one that really forced me to be creative, to try to get the students involved in the learning and not be just kind of that lecture-based traditional history teacher. I really mimicked a college professor that I had had who basically used storytelling to teach history. And I tried my best to work that in as much as I could, because if the students didn't feel like they were learning history, they were more receptive to learning history. And so it really became kind of a key tool in my teacher toolbox. So those challenges of getting them to engage and dealing with just the hormonal hurricane that is 13 and 14-year-olds, it was tough, but it also allowed me to, again, build wonderful relationships. If you can win over a kid who does not like teachers, and let them know that people do care about them and that you're not just there to give them useless information, but you're there in a variety of different ways, and you want to help them become the best version of themselves. You can create some wonderful lifelong relationships. And again, I was able to establish some peer relationships, some relationships with my colleagues that have been incredibly important in the decade since. So I ended up working there for 3 years, and got the opportunity to come back home to the school that I grew up attending, the school that my kids attend. And there's a very interesting kind of back and forth that goes on in your mind whenever you get offered a job at your old school. Part of you says, this is going to be easier because I'm not having to learn a whole new system. I'm not having to introduce myself to all these new people and learn their, nuanced relationships and the kind of branching off that happens in the teacher's lounge, where this group is coupled over here and this group is over here and they don't really hang out with each other. Because I knew these people. I had known a lot of these people my whole life. If you grew up in a small town, the teachers don't change, right? Like they're there for 1,000 years and then they retire. And so that part of it gave me a lot of comfort, knowing that I was coming home to be with people that I knew. And then on the flip side, you start to think like, yeah, if I know them, they know me. And so you start to go, well, did they like me? Was I a student that they really want to work with? And are they going to treat me like a colleague? And that would actually end up being a bit of a challenge early on. They liked me. They were kind to me. But for a lot of teachers, it was kind of difficult to see me as anything other than the student who had grown up there. So early on, there were times where I didn't feel like I was taken all that seriously. And that's not a knock on them. I find myself in the same situation now. I'm at an age where students that I started off teaching are adults, and they're, coming into their field, whether it be teaching or something else professionally. And it's hard for me to kind of take that view of them as my student and kind of pull that out of my brain and go, no, they're a professional. They're trained. They know what they're doing, or they wouldn't have this job. And so there were some growing pains early on where I definitely felt that I had more to offer than what I was being given the opportunity to do. But I felt comfortable kind of for the first time in a long time. And I felt like I was finally at a point in my career where I had confidence. I knew what was expected of me, and I knew that if given the opportunity, I was going to succeed at it. Um, and as much as I had kind of disliked the idea of getting the special ed workload in my previous position, it actually was a blessing in disguise because special ed is what I was teaching once I came back home. And so it kind of created a new love that I didn't necessarily even realize I had. A group of students who kind of get misrepresented quite a bit. They do oftentimes need a lot of help, but there's a difference between needing a lot of help and being helpless. And I think that a lot of teachers, especially older teachers who were teaching in a time where the inclusion model wasn't in place, and so you didn't necessarily have a ton of direct contact with students who were in special education, they kind of created this false narrative in their mind about these kids not being capable. And what I learned in my time working in special ed is that these kids, a lot of them were capable of anything you threw in front of them. And they just needed the support. They needed somebody to show them what that process looked like, and let them know that it was okay to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail again until you got where you were trying to go. Incremental growth is huge in special education. And it was the first time in my career where I wasn't grading myself on this pass or fail kind of mindset. Are my students better today than they were yesterday? Are they understanding these concepts better today than they were yesterday? Or with this benchmark versus the last benchmark? And I think it might have been one of the most important eye-openers for me in more than a decade of education. That this idea that it's not about whether we're passing or failing. Our job as educators is to develop young minds, and part of that development is growth, creating a passion for getting better and building a foundation in these kids of every day is an opportunity to get one step closer to whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And if I didn't have a good day today, that doesn't mean that I failed. It means that tomorrow I've got another opportunity for a good day. And so with that, I kind of thought that I would be doing that for the rest of my life. I really enjoyed not necessarily working with special ed. Like I wasn't opposed to the idea of continuing to work with special ed, but that mindset of teaching, I thought was going to be the thing that propelled me into a 30-year career. And then I had an opportunity to go work in higher ed. And when I talk to people, I think there's this mindset, because there's been kind of a recent exodus of teachers, that people just assume if you're no longer a teacher, it's because you hated being a teacher and you didn't want to do it anymore. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I refuse to close the door on teaching because I did love it. I was passionate about it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that there aren't some major issues in public education. But it was never about the teaching. Something doesn't have to be terrible for something else to be a wonderful opportunity. And the opportunity to work in higher education meant not only a chance for me to further my own education through some of the benefits that are available with the higher ed positions, but also a chance to take care of my kids. Coming from a background where I didn't know how I was going to pay for college, I just knew that I needed to figure it out. To be able to put my kids in a position where that's not a concern for them. Because, again, with the benefit that comes with working in higher ed, I know that my kids' education is taken care of. That, to me, was enough of an incentive to step away from the classroom, but not to step away from education. Because in my role now, I still get the opportunity to work with educators. I still get the opportunity to surround myself with brilliant people who are trying to find new ways to engage students. I've been very fortunate to also get the opportunity to create this network of wonderful educators across the country. I am an advisor in an EDD program, and I previously worked in recruitment and enrollment, enrolling teachers into master's programs and teachers' aides into bachelor's programs. And so I've had the opportunity to build relationships with wonderful educators in all different parts of the country. And I wouldn't have been able to do that had I been still teaching in the classroom. So there are a lot of things that I miss about being a teacher. But I do feel like I'm very fulfilled and I'm getting a wonderful opportunity with what I'm doing now. What it doesn't do is it doesn't change my passion for public education. I am the product of public ed. I only ever wanted to teach public ed. My kids go to public school. And as I mentioned earlier, my daughter is going to be a public school teacher. The issues that are facing education are still impactful to me because it impacts my children. It will impact my grandchildren. It will impact me if I do end up back in the classroom. And it impacts my friends and people I dearly care about. So I will not stop fighting for positive change in public education just because I'm no longer in the classroom. So as I close this out, what can you expect from the podcast moving forward? I know today was a lot of me sitting and rambling about my own experience, but that's not going to be the case. I wanted to provide a little insight, a little background into why this means something to me. My goal moving forward is to provide a voice for educators, an opportunity, a platform to talk about the things that are most important to you, things that are going to require some significant changes in the coming years if public education is going to survive. We are seeing people fleeing the classroom. Teachers are not wanting to retire as teachers anymore. People who have loved the profession for years have decided to walk away. We're also seeing a drop in the number of undergraduates that are trying to become teachers. So much so that different states are putting, legislation into place to provide opportunities for people who don't have an education to become teachers. And I think it would be really important for us that are in the profession or that have been in the profession to make our voices heard as this continues to take place, because I'm not against the idea of providing new avenues to becoming a teacher, but nobody knows what it takes to be an educator more than educators. And so it's really important that we let our voices be heard. We come up with real solutions for the issues that are being faced. It's very easy to sit around in the teacher's lounge and complain about the way students are behaving or the lack of discipline or, state legislation. But what's the resolution? How do we fix it? I'm a big proponent of always coming into a situation with kind of a solution-oriented mindset. I'm not going to complain about something if I'm not trying to find a way to fix it. And so that's going to be a big part of what I want this podcast to be, is let's talk about those issues. Let's be open and honest about things that you've faced, but let's also be realistic about what changes can be made in order to kind of alleviate some of those issues. But I don't want it all just to be about the negative side. There's a lot of wonderful things that are going on in education. There are a lot of brilliant young teachers that are coming in with this completely different mindset on what the newer generation of students needs to be successful. It is one of the biggest complaints that I hear from teachers is that they just can't grasp the attention of students because they're overstimulated. But you've got a batch of teachers coming in right now that are kind of that same generation. Use them. Listen to them. They know what they're talking about. They know what these kids are looking for. They know how they're learning best. Don't just assume that because it's worked a certain way for 30 years that it's going to continue to work that way for the next 30 years. That's not how we evolve as a profession. So I really do hope that you will ride this thing out with me as the podcast continues to get better and better and bigger, and we are able to bring on some incredibly amazing, brilliant guests. And I hope that we can make some changes, because I really do think that teaching is one of the most important professions out there, and we need good people doing it. So as we move forward, make sure that you stay up to date on upcoming podcasts by checking out the link tree, and the link will pop up here in the video. That will have a link to my website, all of our social media channels, as well as the shop if you want to support us with t-shirts and other items that will go straight toward supporting the show. We really appreciate it, and I hope to see you again next week.